When the world goes quiet, some voices still remain. Not every soul finds peace when the clock strikes 12. There are stories hidden in the shadows, whispers drifting between the living and the forgotten. Some stories linger, some souls don't leave. Welcome to Stillness After Midnight, where every silence tells a story. If you're drawn to the mysteries that stir after dark, the voices that echo when the world sleeps, subscribe now and join us as we listen to the souls who still have something to say, because in the stillness, the truth finally speaks. I still remember the first time I set foot in Hanoi, though it feels less like a memory and more like a dream I've been wandering in ever since. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and the faint sweetness of incense, drifting from shrines tucked into corners I had yet to notice. I had come with a simple purpose, or so I believed at the time, to gather stories, traditions, and whispers of forgotten rituals for a book I had been planning to write for years. My name is Daniel Morgan. I was 35, a journalist who had grown weary of politics and scandals in the United States. What fascinated me most were the fragments of folklore that refused to die, the pieces of cultural memory passed down like fragile heirlooms. That curiosity led me across oceans into countries where belief and superstition still breathed in the daily lives of ordinary people. Vietnam was my next destination, and I had chosen Hanoi for its reputation. An ancient city layered with history, its streets haunted not only by war, but by older, quieter ghosts. The house I rented sat inside a narrow alley not far from the old quarter. It wasn't much, a two-room dwelling with peeling walls and a roof that sighed whenever the wind pressed too hard, but it was exactly the kind of place I wanted. The landlord, a wiry man with a voice rough from years of smoking, handed me the keys with little ceremony. But as he walked me through the alley for the first time, his tone shifted. "You must remember this," he said, stopping near the end of the alley. There, against a crumbling brick wall, stood a small altar. It was nothing grand, a simple wooden structure with a clay pot filled with incense sticks, most of them burned down to ash. Wax dripped from two half-melted candles, and a bowl of fruit sat in offering, flies circling lazily above it. Yet something about it made me pause. The smoke of the incense curled upward, twisting like pale fingers before dissolving into the dusk. "When you pass here," the landlord continued, lowering his voice, "you bow. Light incense if you have it. Whisper a prayer. Always." I must have looked confused because he added quickly, "If you don't, you'll regret it. The people of this alley know. Everyone respects this altar. No exceptions." I wanted to ask why, but his eyes darted to the shadows behind us, and he shook his head. He left me with the keys, muttered something about having work to do, and disappeared down the street before I could press him further. That night, after I unpacked my suitcase and sat by the small desk in my room, I thought about the altar. Superstitions like that weren't new to me. In Japan, I had once been told never to whistle at night, lest I summon spirits. In Thailand, a friend warned me against stepping over offerings left on the ground. But something about this altar unsettled me more deeply. Perhaps it was the way the landlord's voice trembled, or the smell of incense that seemed to cling to my clothes long after I'd returned inside. I slept fitfully, waking to the distant sound of motorbikes echoing through the city. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the alley. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. But when I leaned out my window, the narrow street lay empty, bathed in the dim orange glow of a single street lamp. The following morning, I ventured out to buy breakfast. As I walked past the altar, I noticed a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, stop in front of it. She lit 3 sticks of incense, bowed her head, and whispered something I could not hear. Only when she had finished did she continue down the alley. A few moments later, an old man with a bamboo cane did the same. In fact, everyone who passed performed this ritual, some with hurried gestures, others with solemn care. I stood watching for several minutes, fascinated. When it came time for me to pass, I hesitated. Should I mimic their actions? I had no incense, and I felt foolish bowing to something I didn't understand. Still, not wanting to draw attention, I gave a small nod and continued on my way. That day I explored Hanoi, losing myself in its chaos. The swarming motorbikes, the cries of street vendors selling po and banh mi, the bright red flags fluttering above narrow streets. Yet no matter how far I wandered, the image of that altar returned to me. It seemed to whisper in the back of my mind, a quiet reminder that I had ignored a rule without knowing its consequences. By evening, I returned to the alley. The air was damp, and the scent of incense grew stronger as I neared the altar. A group of neighbors were gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones. They fell silent when I approached, their eyes flicking briefly toward me before turning back to the smoke. One of them, an older woman with a basket of sticky rice, gave me a wary smile. "You're new here," she said in careful English. I nodded. "Yes, I just arrived yesterday." She studied me for a moment, then gestured toward the altar. "You must show respect. Everyone does. If you don't—" She paused, lowering her voice until it was almost a whisper. "At night someone will come to sit by your bed." Her words sent a chill through me, though I forced a polite laugh. "A ghost story?" Her expression did not change. "Not a story. A warning." Before I could ask more, she shuffled away, her basket swinging gently at her side. The other neighbors avoided my gaze. That night, I lit a candle in my room and tried to write. I wanted to capture the feeling of Hanoi, the mixture of life and silence, of noise and shadows. But my pen faltered. The words felt flat, hollow, as if I were only scratching the surface of something far deeper. Outside, the alley grew quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper, the rustle of leaves, the clink of distant dishes being washed, the faint scrape of something moving just beyond the reach of sight. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of wooden footsteps. Not shoes, not sandals, but something heavier, like the tapping of wooden clogs on stone. They came slowly, echoing up the alley until they stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, listening. Silence followed. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the window, I saw nothing but the faint glow of incense smoke drifting in the darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just the creak of wood or the echo of someone passing. But deep down, a seed of unease had taken root. The altar at the end of the alley was not just tradition, it was something else. Something that seemed to wait, patient and silent, for me to make a mistake. And though I could not explain why, I felt that mistake was already beginning. The following day settled into a kind of rhythm, though not a comforting one. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for two motorbikes to pass each other, and lined with houses whose walls leaned so close they seemed to whisper to one another. Laundry hung overhead like faded flags, and at night the air smelled of fish sauce, charcoal, and incense. Always incense. I began to notice how every resident, no matter how hurried, paused at the altar. Some carried small bundles of joss sticks in their pockets, lighting them with the ease of long practice. Others bowed deeply, their foreheads nearly touching the ground. Even children darting past with the reckless energy of youth slowed their steps and pressed their palms together before running on. It was as though the entire alley revolved around that single point, like planets circling an invisible sun. And I, foreigner that I was, orbited outside of it, drawn in yet uncertain of its gravity. One morning, as I sipped a bitter cup of Vietnamese coffee at a small stall near the entrance of the alley, I asked the vendor, a thin man with a face weathered like bark, about the altar. He looked up sharply, his expression tightening. "Better not to ask," he muttered, pouring hot water over the coffee grounds. "Why?" I pressed. "Because questions bring answers," he said flatly, and slid the cup toward me without meeting my eyes. Later that day, I encountered the old woman with the basket of sticky rice again. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though her feet remembered paths older than the stones beneath them. Summoning my courage, I walked beside her. "Can you tell me about the altar?" I asked softly. Her eyes flicked toward me, cloudy with age yet sharp enough to pierce through pretense. She shook her head at first, then sighed. Foreign man, she said, her voice thin but steady. Some things are carried not in words but in silence. Still, silence has weight, and sometimes it is too heavy. We stopped in front of the altar. Smoke curled upward from 3 freshly lit sticks. She gestured to them. Every family here makes offering, not for blessing, not for fortune, for peace. I frowned. Peace for whom? Her lips pressed together, as though she regretted saying even that much. For us, she whispered finally, and for them. Before I could ask who they were, she turned away, disappearing into her house without another word. That night, lying in bed, I replayed her words. Peace for us and for them. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than a tradition, like leaving flowers at a grave. Yet the conviction in her voice told me otherwise. The next evening, I was invited to join a group of neighbors gathered around low plastic stools, sharing tea under a flickering bulb. Their conversation flowed quickly in Vietnamese, but one man, middle-aged with thick glasses, spoke some English and translated for me. They were curious about my country, my reasons for coming here, the kind of stories I wrote. When I mentioned my interest in folklore, a hush fell over the group. The man with glasses adjusted them nervously and leaned closer. There are stories here, he said quietly, but not all stories are safe to tell. I smiled, thinking he was joking, but his face remained grave. An elderly man with trembling hands muttered something. The translator hesitated, then explained. He says, once a boy in this alley laughed at the altar, said it was only wood and ash. That night his mother found him screaming. He said someone was sitting at the end of his bed watching. The next morning he could not speak. His voice never returned. The group nodded solemnly as though confirming a well-known fact. Another woman spoke rapidly, her words sharp. The translator paled before relaying them. She says, do not ignore the altar. If you walk past without bowing, they will follow you. First in dreams, then in shadows. A chill crept up my spine. I wanted to ask who they were. The ones said to follow, but something in the way the neighbors avoided my eyes told me not to. Instead, I sipped my tea, the bitterness coating my tongue, and listened as the conversation drifted to safer topics. When the gathering ended, the woman with the sticky rice basket pulled me aside once more. You think we are afraid of old stories, she said, but stories live because something keeps them alive. Do not be the one who wakes it. Her words clung to me like smoke. In the days that followed, I began to feel watched, not in a paranoid sense, but in the way one feels when walking alone in a forest, the certainty that unseen eyes rest upon you. Whenever I passed the altar, the incense smoke seemed to curl toward me, reaching out like ghostly fingers. I started carrying joss sticks in my pocket, purchased from a vendor near the market. Lighting them before the altar became a habit, though one tinged with unease. Each time I whispered words I didn't fully understand, hoping they were enough. Still, at night the footsteps returned, wooden, deliberate, pacing just beyond my door. I told myself it was neighbors, late wanderers, anything but what the whisper suggested. Yet the neighbors never walked the alley at that hour. Their doors were shut tight, their windows dark. One evening, as I lingered near the altar, I overheard 2 young men speaking. They didn't notice me in the shadows. Do you think it's true? One asked in Vietnamese, his voice uncertain. The other replied, why do you think I never forget to bow? My uncle didn't once. He dreamed of a woman sitting at his bed. She followed him for months. He left the city, but she found him again. He died in his sleep. The first man shivered visibly. Then why don't they move the altar? Destroy it? The other shook his head. You can't destroy memory. It destroys you first. At that moment, they noticed me and fell silent, their eyes darting away. I pretended not to understand, but their words burned into me. The more I listened, the clearer the pattern became. The altar was not for worship, but for containment. It was a fragile barrier between the living and something else, and the neighbors lived their lives around it like people living near a river known to flood, respecting the danger, fearing its return, never daring to ignore it. That night, as I lay awake, I wondered what would happen if I ignored the altar deliberately. Part of me, the journalist, the seeker of stories, wanted to test it, to see if the whispers were true. But another part of me, the part that woke sweating when the footsteps paused outside my door, urged me not to. And in that silence, I realized something. The alley was not merely a place I had rented a room in. It was a story already unfolding, a story I had stepped into without understanding. And stories, especially the ones whispered in fear, have a way of claiming those who listen too closely. It was on the seventh night that I finally gave in to my curiosity. For nearly a week I had done as the neighbors did, pausing at the altar, lighting incense, bowing with awkward reverence. Each time I felt like an imposter, mimicking a ritual whose meaning I only half understood. The neighbors seemed to accept my gestures, though their eyes always lingered on me a little too long, as if waiting to see whether I would slip. And slip I eventually did. That evening I had been drinking with a fellow traveler in the old quarter, a French photographer who scoffed at the very idea of ghosts. He told me stories of abandoned houses in Cambodia where locals refused to tread, and of how he had camped there overnight without so much as a flicker of unease. His laughter was infectious, and by the time I staggered back through the labyrinth of Hanoi streets, the shadows seemed less threatening, the air less heavy. When I reached the mouth of my alley, the altar stood waiting as always, its incense burning faintly in the humid night. The smoke curled upward like a warning finger. But in my haze of wine and bravado, I did not stop. I walked past without bowing, without even glancing back, my footsteps echoing too loudly against the stones. It was only later, lying in bed, that regret began to stir. The night was thick, the air pressing down like wet cloth. I tossed and turned, the ceiling fan above me doing little more than pushing the heat from one corner of the room to another. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging me into a shallow, uneasy dream. I found myself back in the alley, but it was empty, drained of color. The houses leaned closer than before, their windows black holes. At the far end, the altar glowed faintly, its incense burning, though no flame touched it. I walked toward it, yet with every step, the alley seemed to stretch longer, the altar retreating farther. And then I heard it, cock, 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 the sound of wooden clogs on stone. It came from behind me, steady and deliberate. I turned, but the alley stretched into darkness, empty. Still the sound grew closer. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the air itself resisted me. The footsteps followed, echoing, until they were right beside me, though no one was there. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. My room was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it again. Not in the dream this time. In the room. Cock, cock. The sound of wood on tile moving slowly across the floor. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst. I reached for the lamp on the bedside table, fumbling with trembling fingers. The switch clicked, bathing the room in pale yellow light. There was nothing. The floor was bare. The door was shut. The windows were locked. Yet the air smelled faintly of incense, though I had lit none. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, the residue of a dream. But when I turned to lie back down, I froze. At the foot of my bed, for the briefest of moments, I saw her. A woman seated calmly, her back straight, her hair long and black as ink. Her face was pale, blurred, as though I were looking through smoke. She did not move, did not speak, only sat there, watching. I blinked and she was gone, but the indentation on the mattress remained, a faint dip in the fabric where no one should have been. I did not sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally arrived, The alley outside was alive with the chatter of neighbors, the clatter of bowls, the hiss of frying oil. It seemed impossible that the night had held such silence, such dread. Yet when I stepped outside, the neighbors looked at me differently. The old woman with the sticky rice shook her head slowly. "You did not bow," she said, as though she had seen it herself. I opened my mouth to protest, then stopped. Her eyes were not accusing, but pitying. "You must be careful," she whispered. "Once they notice you, they do not forget." Her words haunted me throughout the day. I tried to distract myself by wandering through the city, the temples with their golden roofs, the lakes reflecting clouds, the chaotic dance of motorbikes. But everywhere I went, I caught glimpses. A figure in the corner of my eye, a reflection in a shop window that lingered a moment too long, the faint scent of incense drifting where there should have been none. That night I placed a stick of incense at the altar, bowing so deeply my forehead nearly touched the ground. The neighbors nodded approvingly, but their expressions held no reassurance. It was as if I had already crossed a line, and no gesture could erase it. When I returned to my room, I checked every lock twice, every corner of the room 3 times. Still, when the lights were off, the air pressed down with the same heavy silence. And though I did not see her that night, I could feel it. The weight at the end of the bed, unseen yet undeniable. The first omen had come, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it would not be the last. The morning after that sleepless night, I knew I could no longer ignore the altar. The unease had grown roots, sinking into my bones. I felt like a man who had stumbled into the first act of a play without realizing it, only to find himself already cast in the leading role. I needed answers. It was the old woman with the basket of sticky rice who gave me my first direction. She found me sitting outside the house, staring blankly at the smoke rising from the altar. Her face was stern, but her eyes softened when she saw the exhaustion written across mine. "You should go to the temple," she said quietly. "Temple?" I repeated, unsure if I had heard her correctly. She nodded toward the distant sound of bells that floated faintly above the morning clamor of Hanoi. "Chua Tran Quoc. The monks know more than we do. They remember." The idea of speaking to a monk appealed to me, someone who might balance superstition with reason, someone who could anchor this spiraling fear with history. I thanked her, and that afternoon, I made my way to Tran Quoc Pagoda. The temple sat on a small island in Westlake, connected by a narrow causeway. Its red brick tower rose against the sky, framed by tall palms and the rippling water below. The moment I stepped onto the grounds, the noise of the city seemed to fall away, replaced by the soft murmurs of prayer and the steady rhythm of a bell. Inside the temple, the air was thick with incense. Rows of golden Buddhas gazed serenely at me, their eyes both watchful and distant. A young novice guided me to an older monk, his robe faded with years, his head bowed in meditation. When I explained, haltingly, in broken Vietnamese and English, the monk listened without interruption. His eyes were half closed, but when I described the footsteps, the woman at my bed, his gaze sharpened. "The altar," he said finally, his voice deep and steady, "is not for gods. It is for ghosts." A shiver ran through me. "Ghosts?" He nodded. "Long ago, before I was born, before even my teacher was born, that alley was different. There was a courtyard there, a gathering place. In the time of war, soldiers came. They killed without reason. Men, women, children. Their bodies were left in the street." His words painted images I did not want to see. The narrow alley filled with blood, the cries of the dying echoing against the walls. "The families who survived could not bury the dead properly," the monk continued. "There was no time, no safety. So they built the altar. They burned incense to keep the spirits calm, to give them a place to rest. Without it, the alley would never have known peace again." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "And if someone disrespects the altar?" The monk's eyes were steady on mine. "The dead do not forgive being forgotten." Silence hung heavy between us. Outside, the bell tolled again, slow and solemn. I asked him if there was a way to make amends, a way to undo the mistake of passing by without bowing. He shook his head. You can honor them. You can remember them. But once their eyes are on you, they do not turn away. I left the temple with incense clinging to my skin, the monk's words echoing in my mind. The city felt different now, as though beneath its bustling surface lay a hidden layer of ash and bone. Every alley seemed to hold shadows of the past, every flicker of smoke a reminder of lives cut short. When I returned to my alley, the altar looked unchanged, but I no longer saw it as a simple structure of wood and clay. It was a wound, hastily bandaged, still bleeding beneath the surface. That night I dreamed again. I stood in the alley, but it was not the alley I knew. It was wider, open, filled with people. Families gathered around small fires, children laughing, women carrying baskets. Then the sound came, gunfire sudden and deafening. Screams followed, bodies fell, blood pooled where the cobblestones should have been. Through the smoke I saw a woman clutching a child. She turned toward me, her face pale with terror. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. Then in a motion that felt both slow and inevitable, she extended her hand toward me. I woke with my own hand stretched into the darkness. The room smelled of ash, though the incense I had left burning earlier had long since burned out. In the morning I spoke with the neighbors again, hoping to confirm what the monk had told me. They were reluctant, their voices dropping to whispers, their eyes darting toward the altar, as though even mentioning its history might rouse the spirits. One man, younger than the rest, finally broke the silence. My grandmother told me, he said, that her mother saw it happen. She said the earth of the alley was so soaked with blood, no rain could wash it clean. That's why the altar burns incense day and night, to cover the smell. Another neighbor added, some nights if the incense goes out, you can still hear them, crying, calling for someone to remember. Their words layered over the monks, over my dreams, until the line between history and nightmare blurred completely. That evening, I lit incense at the altar myself. I bowed, whispering a prayer I didn't understand, hoping that sincerity mattered more than language. The smoke rose in thin spirals, catching the light of a nearby lantern. For a moment, I thought I saw shapes in it, faces forming and dissolving, mouths opening in silent cries. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Peace for us, and for them. The old woman's words echoed like a mantra, but the truth weighed heavily. Peace was fragile, temporary, and easily broken, and I had already broken it. The morning after I heard the story of blood in the alley, I woke with a strange determination. Fear still clung to me like damp cloth, but beneath it there was something else, a hunger. I had come to Vietnam chasing stories, and now one had fallen into my lap. It was no longer just whispers or dreams. It was history haunting the present. I wanted proof. That afternoon, I borrowed a camera from a French traveler I'd befriended at a cafe near Hoan Kiem Lake. He chuckled when I told him why. You think you'll capture a ghost? He teased, passing me the old Nikon. Not a ghost, I said, though even then I wasn't certain. Just something. The camera felt heavier than I expected, as though it carried not only its own weight but the burden of what I hoped to find. When dusk fell, I stood before the altar once again. The neighbors moved around me with their usual rhythm, lighting incense, bowing, whispering prayers. I waited until the alley had grown quiet, until the last family had retreated into their home. The air smelled thick with smoke and fried garlic, but beneath it lingered something colder, metallic, like rust. I lifted the camera and began to take photos. The altar from the front, the curling smoke, the faded offerings of fruit and rice, the shadows cast by the single dim bulb strung overhead. I clicked and clicked, adjusting angles, crouching low, standing back. Each frame was ordinary, yet every time I pressed the shutter, I felt a pulse of unease, as though I were drawing attention I didn't want. Finally, I lowered the camera and whispered, more to myself than anyone. Show me. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. I hurried back to my room, eager to see what I had captured. The Nikon was old, not digital, so I had to take the film to be developed. The wait stretched into days, each one restless with anticipation. At night, I dreamed of smoke twisting into faces, of shutters clicking in empty alleys, of eyes staring back through the lens. When the envelope of photographs was finally handed to me, my fingers trembled as I opened it. The first few images were unremarkable. The altar, the smoke, the fruit offerings. But then I reached the fifth photo, and my breath caught. There, in the upper corner of the frame, partially obscured by smoke, was a face. A woman's face. Her eyes were wide and dark, her expression unreadable. Her hair spilled across her shoulders, long and black, blending into the shadows. She was not standing in front of the altar, but behind it, where there had been nothing when I pressed the shutter. I stared at the photo for so long that my vision blurred. My first thought was a flaw in the film, a trick of the light. But the details were too sharp, too deliberate. The curve of her cheek, the glint in her eyes. I flipped through the rest of the photos. Two more showed her, faint but undeniable, always in the same place, behind the altar, watching. By the time I reached the end of the stack, my hands were slick with sweat. I wanted to show someone, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when I thought of the neighbors, of their wary glances, I knew what their response would be. They wouldn't be surprised. They would only nod, as if confirming what they already knew. Still, I needed a second opinion. That evening, I brought the photographs to the French photographer. He spread them across the cafe table, studying each with a growing frown. "This is strange," he admitted. "At first I thought it was double exposure, but the consistency is too clean. Look, same face, same position, even though you took these at different angles. That's not an accident." "So you see her too?" I pressed. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but I don't like it." He pushed the photos back toward me, as though eager to be rid of them. "Burn them," he said. "Some images are better left unseen." I laughed nervously, but his expression was deadly serious. That night, I laid the photographs on my bed. The woman's face stared back at me, smoke curling around her like a shroud. The longer I looked, the more I felt she was not trapped in the image, but gazing through it, watching me as I watched her. I turned them face down, but it made no difference. The weight of her eyes remained. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams. In one, I stood before the altar again, camera in hand. I raised it to my eye, but when I pressed the shutter, the flash illuminated not the altar, but my own room. And there she was, sitting at the end of my bed, closer than before. I woke gasping, the sheets tangled around me like restraints. The photographs lay scattered on the floor, though I had left them neatly stacked. The next day, I decided to follow the Frenchman's advice. I gathered the photos, carried them to a small clay pot outside, and set them alight. The paper curled and blackened, the woman's face twisting into smoke. For a moment, I felt relief, but when the ashes settled, a faint image remained burned into the charred fragments, the outline of her eyes still watching. I scattered the ashes quickly, my hands shaking. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, closer. And when I dared to glance toward the foot of my bed, I didn't just see her. I saw the faint shimmer of others, faces half-formed, crowding the shadows, pressing in around me. The photographs had not captured her. They had invited her. Sleep used to be my escape. No matter how restless the day, no matter how unsettling the whispers of the alley, night once promised a few hours of oblivion. But after the photographs, sleep became a trap, one I stumbled into every night with dread. The first dream came the evening after I burned the images. I found myself once more in the narrow alley, though it was not quite the same. The stones beneath my feet glistened as if wet, though no rain fell. The houses loomed taller, their windows blind and dark, leaning inward as if to listen. The altar glowed faintly at the far end, its incense burning without flame, the smoke thick and choking. And there she was, the woman. She stood beside the altar, her form clearer than ever. Her hair hung long and heavy, her skin pale as bone, but her eyes were what held me. Dark pools, bottomless, filled with a sorrow so profound it rooted me where I stood. She did not speak, yet her lips moved. Shapes of words formed silently, dissolving into the smoke before I could grasp them. I wanted to run, but my body betrayed me. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me closer. With each step, the air grew colder, the smell of incense sharper, until it was almost suffocating. When I stood before her, she raised a hand. Long, slender fingers reached toward my chest, not to strike, but to touch, as though searching for something beneath my skin. The instant she brushed me, the world collapsed. I woke gasping, clutching my chest. My room was dark, but not silent. Cock, cock, cock. The wooden footsteps circled the bed, slow and deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but the sound only grew louder. Finally, when silence returned, I dared to look. At the foot of the bed, the blanket was pressed down as though someone sat there. The shape was faint, shifting, but unmistakable. She had followed me out of the dream. The nights after that grew worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the alley. Sometimes she sat at the altar, silent. Sometimes she stood closer, her face inches from mine, her breath cold against my cheek. Each time she tried to speak, and each time the words dissolved into ash before I could understand. But gradually fragments began to form, a single word here, another there. Forgotten, blood, remember. I woke each morning more exhausted than before, as if I had not slept at all. My body ached, my eyes burned, and yet I dreaded the coming of night more than the fatigue of day. The neighbors noticed. The old woman with the sticky rice basket clucked her tongue when she saw me. "She has chosen you," she said softly. "You must listen." "Chosen me for what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The woman shook her head. "Not all questions have safe answers." That evening I tried something different. Before bed I lit incense at the altar, bowing deeply. I whispered aloud, "If you want to speak, then speak. I will listen." That night the dream returned more vivid than ever. I was back in the alley, but this time it was filled with people. Dozens of them, their faces pale and hollow, their clothes tattered. Men, women, children, all silent, all watching me. They stood in rows, their bodies lining the walls, their eyes dark with hunger. At the center stood the woman. She moved toward me, her steps slow but inevitable. When she reached me, she leaned close. Her lips brushed my ear, and for the first time, I heard her voice. It was not a whisper, but a lament, heavy with centuries of grief. "They left us," she said. "They left us to the fire, to the blades, to the silence. We wait, we burn, we wait." Her voice cracked, breaking like dry wood. "Do not forget us." I tried to answer, but my throat closed. The crowd of figures pressed closer, their faces twisted in longing, in rage. The alley walls bent inward, trapping me. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat. The neighbors pounded on my door, alarmed by the noise. When they saw me, pale, trembling, drenched, they said nothing. They simply left bowls of rice and small sticks of incense outside my door. Offerings. I understood then, the dreams were not dreams. They were visits, invitations, warnings. The woman was not content to haunt the altar. She was reaching beyond it, pulling me into their world piece by piece. And though fear clawed at me, another realization struck deeper. She did not want to kill me. Not yet. She wanted me to remember. The question was, what exactly did she want remembered? It was the old woman with the sticky rice who suggested the vigil. You cannot keep walking alone into their dreams, she told me one morning, her voice stern but kind. The spirits are restless. If you want them to release you, you must join the living in remembering the dead. That evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops and the alley dimmed into shadow, the neighbors gathered. It was the first time I had seen so many of them outside together. Usually the alley was quiet after dark, but that night every doorway spilled light. Every family stepped into the street. They carried candles, small bowls of rice, and bundles of incense. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed, while the elders moved with steady hands, their faces lined with solemn duty. They placed the offerings around the altar till it was crowded with bowls, fruit, and burning sticks. The smoke thickened, rising like a curtain, veiling the night. I stood among them, a foreigner, awkward and unsure. Yet they beckoned me closer, as if I too belonged to this act of remembrance. When the last candle was lit, silence fell. The only sounds were the hiss of burning wax and the faint crackle of incense. Then slowly the eldest man in the alley began to chant. His voice was low, carrying the weight of years. Others joined him, their tones weaving together into a mournful rhythm. I did not know the words, but their sound pressed into me, vibrating in my chest. It was not music for the living, but for those unseen, drifting between. I closed my eyes, trying to surrender to the rhythm. At first it was almost soothing, the soft drone, the warmth of candlelight. But then the air shifted. The smoke no longer rose gently. It swirled violently, as if caught in an invisible wind. The candles flickered, their flames stretching unnaturally long, bending toward the altar. A sudden chill swept down the alley, raising gooseflesh on my arms. The chanting faltered, voices wavering. Still the old man continued, louder now, his voice trembling but unbroken. That was when I heard it, not the chanting, not the wind, but footsteps. Cock, cock, cock. The sound of wooden clogs on stone, echoing through the alley. The neighbors froze, their eyes darting to one another. No one moved, yet the footsteps drew closer, steady and relentless. Then through the smoke, I saw her, the woman. She stood at the edge of the circle of light, her hair long, her face pale, her eyes fixed on me. She was clearer than ever before, no longer a blur of dream or photograph. Her form shimmered faintly, as though she were made of ash and moonlight. But she was there. The chanting faltered completely. Silence swallowed the alley, heavy and suffocating. She raised her hand, pointing, not at the altar, not at the offerings, but at me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt every gaze turned toward me, heavy as stones. The old man stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What do you want from him?" The woman's lips moved. For a moment, no sound came. Then, like a gust of wind rushing through dry leaves, her voice filled the alley. "Remember?" The candles flickered violently. One by one, they went out, plunging the alley into near darkness. The incense smoke thickened until it was difficult to breathe. Shapes stirred within it. Faces, faint and fleeting, mouths open in silent cries. The neighbors panicked. Some clutched their children and fled inside, slamming doors behind them. Others dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the ground, chanting prayers through chattering teeth. I stood frozen, caught between terror and fascination. The woman's eyes held me like a hook. In them I saw not anger, but endless grief. She took a step closer. The air around her shimmered, and with each step, more shapes emerged from the smoke. Men with hollow eyes, women clutching invisible infants, children whose mouths moved in soundless wails. The alley was filling with them. The old man dropped his incense and fell silent, his face pale as wax. He turned to me, his voice breaking. "She will not leave you. You must carry what she gives." "What do you mean?" I whispered, but before he could answer, the woman reached me. Her hand rose again, trembling, and pressed against my chest. A shock of cold seared through me, stealing my breath. Images flooded my mind. Fire consuming houses, soldiers shouting, blood on cobblestones, bodies piled where the altar now stood. I saw her among them, clutching her child, screaming for help that never came. I saw the moment her body fell, her eyes wide with horror. And then I felt it, the weight of all their deaths, heavy and suffocating, pressing into me as though they sought to anchor themselves inside my very bones. I fell to my knees, gasping. Around me the figures flickered like dying flames, their shapes dissolving into the smoke. The woman's hand lingered a moment longer, then slipped away. When I looked up, she was gone. So were the others. Only the altar remained, its incense still burning, its candles melted to wax. The alley was silent once more. The neighbors emerged slowly from their doorways, faces pale, eyes wide. The old man helped me to my feet, his hands shaking. "She has given you the burden," he said. "Now you must decide whether to carry it or be destroyed by it." I could not answer. My chest still burned where her hand had touched, as though her grief had etched itself into my heart. The vigil had not ended the haunting. It had deepened it. The night after the vigil, I could not bear to close my eyes. Every time my lids grew heavy, I felt again the cold press of her hand against my chest, the flood of sorrow she had poured into me. I paced the narrow room until dawn, trying to shake the sensation that I was no longer myself, that a piece of her now lived inside me. When morning came, I thought perhaps the worst had passed. The neighbors moved through the alley quietly, their eyes averted, their voices hushed, as though the vigil had left its mark on them as well. The altar burned as it always did, smoke curling upward, indifferent to the weight of what had occurred. But that night, when I finally surrendered to exhaustion, the dreams returned. I was in the alley again, though it no longer looked like the present. The houses were smaller, built of wood and clay, their roofs sagging. Oil lamps flickered in the windows, casting fragile circles of light. I could hear voices, laughter, conversation, the clatter of bowls. For a moment the alley was alive, vibrant, untouched by violence. Then the sound of boots shattered it. Shouts, gunfire, smoke. The scene dissolved into chaos. People screamed, fled, fell. And in the midst of it, I saw her, the woman. She clutched a child to her chest, her face streaked with tears, her mouth open in a silent cry. Soldiers swarmed around her, their rifles glinting. The dream shifted. Suddenly I stood at the altar, and she stood before me. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her was a boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. His eyes were dark, wide, filled with a fear too old for his small face. His hand clung to hers, his body half hidden behind her skirts. I stared, my throat tight. "Who is he?" I whispered. The woman's lips moved, forming a single word. "Khan." Her child. The boy stepped forward, his gaze locked on mine. There was no malice in his eyes, only longing. He raised his hand slowly, reaching toward me. Smoke curled around his arm, as though the air itself resisted his presence. When his fingers brushed mine, a rush of images consumed me. His laughter as he chased a wooden toy through the alley, his small hands reaching for rice, the terror on his face as flames rose around him. I felt his confusion, his desperate clinging to his mother, his final breath stolen by smoke. I woke sobbing, my hands trembling as though I had truly held his. The next morning, the old woman found me sitting outside, pale and broken. She studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "You saw the child," she said simply. I nodded. Her sigh was heavy, almost weary. "He appears only to those who are marked. It means she has bound you to her grief. You are not only haunted, you are chosen to remember them both." The weight of her words pressed into me. Chosen, not cursed, not hunted. Chosen, but chosen for what? That night I lit incense at the altar, my hands steady despite the fear coiled in my stomach. I bowed low and whispered, "I saw him." I remember him. Tell me what you want me to do. The smoke rose, curling into shapes I almost recognized. Faces formed and dissolved. Voices brushed the edge of hearing. But no answer came. When I lay down to sleep, the child returned. This time he was alone. He stood at the foot of my bed, his small figure wreathed in smoke, his eyes too solemn for his age. He did not speak, but he lifted his hand again, beckoning. I followed him. Whether in dream or in spirit, I could not tell. He led me back to the alley, but it was different. Not past, not present. The houses were ruins, charred and crumbling. The altar stood broken, its offerings scattered. The air was heavy with the stench of ash. The boy stopped before one of the ruined houses. He pointed to the ground. I knelt, my hand brushing the earth. For an instant I felt it. Bones beneath the soil, countless bones, pressed together by time and weight. The child looked at me, his eyes pleading. His lips moved, forming a single word I could finally hear. Remember! The scene dissolved, and I woke gasping, my hands clawing at the sheets. The message was clear now. The altar was not enough. The incense, the offerings, the prayers, they were gestures, not memory. What the woman and her child wanted was not ritual, but remembrance. To be seen, to be known, to have their suffering acknowledged. But how could I carry that burden? I was a stranger, a foreigner who had stumbled into their grief. What right did I have to claim their story? And yet, what choice did I have? They had chosen me. As I sat in the dim glow of the oil lamp, I felt the weight of their eyes upon me. The woman's sorrow, the child's longing. I realized then that I could not escape. Their story was now mine, and I would carry it, even if it consumed me. For days after the child appeared, I could think of little else. Every night he returned in dreams, silent, solemn, always leading me to the same place. The broken houses at the far end of the alley, the ground dark and heavy beneath my feet. Each time he pointed to the earth as though urging me to look deeper. I began to study the alley by daylight, walking slowly, watching the way the stones shifted beneath my shoes, how the moss clung thicker in some places than others. Neighbors watched me with wary eyes but said nothing. Perhaps they knew where I was being led, and perhaps they feared the answer. One morning after another restless night, I found myself at the farthest end of the alley. The houses here were different, older, more fragile, as though time itself had forgotten them. The walls leaned, the shutters sagged, and the earth felt softer beneath my steps. I knelt and pressed my palm to the ground. The soil was damp, though no rain had fallen. A chill seeped into me, not of weather, but of something older, buried. I whispered into the quiet, "Is this where you are?" The wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest sound, like children's laughter, warped and distant. My skin prickled. That night the dream came again, more vivid than ever. The child took my hand this time, guiding me not just to the place, but into it. I felt the earth give way, the soil opening like water. Beneath I saw bones tangled together, men, women, children, all collapsed in a single mass. The woman's face appeared among them, her eyes open, her lips whispering endlessly, "Do not forget us." I woke drenched in sweat, the smell of soil still clinging to my nose, my hands dirty as though I had truly been digging. The next day, I spoke to the old woman. "There are bodies beneath the alley," I said quietly. Her gaze flickered, but she did not look surprised. She only sighed. "We have always known. Our grandparents told us. This place was once a killing ground, but the city built over it, and time buried the memory. Only the spirits remember. Why is there no marker, no shrine beyond the altar?" She shook her head. "Because some truths are too heavy. To name them is to carry them. So we keep the altar and we pray, but we do not dig." Her words lingered in me all day. Too heavy, too dangerous. Yet the weight was already mine. That evening I returned to the far end of the alley. I carried a small lantern and a trowel I had borrowed. My hands shook as I pressed the blade into the soil. At first it was only earth, dark, damp, stubborn. But then, only a few inches down, the metal struck something solid. I brushed the soil aside. Bone, pale, brittle, crumbling beneath my fingers. My chest tightened. I dug further, uncovering more. A jaw, a rib, fragments of skull. They were not arranged like a proper burial, but scattered, layered, as if dumped in haste. The lantern flickered. The air grew heavy. And then I heard it. Soft voices, overlapping, rising from the ground itself. Not screams, but whispers, pleading. Remember us! I stumbled back, the trowel slipping from my hand. The lantern nearly toppled. The whispers grew louder, swirling in the air, pressing against my ears. My heart hammered, and yet I could not look away from the bones. A shape emerged in the smoke, rising from the disturbed earth. The woman, and beside her, the child. They stood silently, watching me. Their forms were clearer than ever, almost solid. The child's eyes locked on mine, and for the first time I heard his voice. Thin, trembling, but unmistakable. You found us. Tears burned my eyes. What do you want me to do? I whispered. The woman raised her hand, pointing to the bones. Her voice was softer now, less like a wind and more like a mother's plea. Give us rest. The lantern sputtered, nearly extinguished. I scrambled to my feet and fled, the sound of whispers chasing me down the alley. That night I did not sleep. I sat by the window, watching the altar smoke curl upward, knowing that below my feet lay hundreds of forgotten souls. The vigil had not been enough. The incense had not been enough. They wanted a grave. They wanted to be remembered not as shadows but as lives, given back the dignity stolen from them. But how could I, a foreigner, a stranger passing through, give them what the living of this alley had denied for generations? The answer pressed heavy against me, relentless, undeniable, because they had chosen me. The following morning I felt restless, weighed down by the memory of the unmarked grave. Sleep had abandoned me, and the child's gaze lingered in the corners of my mind. I needed context, understanding, some anchor to the madness that now gripped the alley. I remembered the small antiquarian bookshop tucked behind a side street near Hoan Kiem Lake, run by a scholar with gray hair and sharp eyes. I had wandered in once, browsing old maps and faded photographs. That seemed like the only place I could seek answers. The bell chimed as I entered, announcing my presence. The shop smelled of parchment, dust, and a faint trace of ink. The scholar, hunched over a wooden desk, looked up and raised an eyebrow. You again, he said, his voice clipped, yet not unkind. Looking for stories, are you? Yes, I admitted, but not just any stories. I need history, the real history of Hanoi's alleys, of what lies at the end of the small alley near Tran Quoc. His expression darkened, and he nodded slowly. Follow me. He led me through narrow aisles lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound tomes. Eventually, he stopped at a small, dimly lit corner. On a low table lay a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The script was elegant but hurried, the ink faded with age. This belonged to a historian, he explained. Born in 1898, lived through the occupation. Few know of him. Fewer still survived his chronicles. I traced my fingers over the cover before opening it. The pages smelled of smoke and time, fragile but intact. The first entries were ordinary, notes on markets, weather, the changing seasons of Hanoi. Then one day in 1947, the tone shifted. The alley at the edge of the old district is no longer safe. Soldiers pass through with little concern for life. They strike without warning. Families vanish. I've seen it, hidden behind the walls, my breath caught in my throat. Children, mothers, fathers, none are spared. Their screams are swallowed by the stone, yet I cannot leave. I must write. I read on, my heart pounding. The historian described day after day of violence, Families cornered and executed, their bodies left in the alley. It was gruesome yet restrained, focusing on the horror of the loss, the fear of witnesses, and the silence imposed by power. Some survivors tried to bury the dead, but fear made them stop. Fires consumed homes, and the alley was left to rot. A few brave souls lit incense, made offerings, but the dead were too many, their sorrow too heavy. A small shrine was erected at the far end, tiny, almost imperceptible, but even this could not quiet them. They linger. They wait. The historian's handwriting became increasingly erratic, ink smudged, words running into each other. Altar, incense. They are patient. Do not forget them. They call always. I fear that one day those who do not listen will see them, as I do. Faces, smoke, children crying. Not all survive the vision. Not all retain sanity. I closed the journal for a moment, shaking. Every word mirrored my own experiences, my dreams, the visions of the woman and the child. This was not folklore. This was history etched in grief, waiting for someone to witness it. The scholar spoke quietly, almost reverently. He wrote what the living could not bear. It is a record of their suffering. He tried to give the dead their story, but the city buried it. And the alley, the altar, it is their reminder. I opened the journal again. The final entries were chilling. Those who walk the alley without bowing, without respect, awaken them. Not all who look are spared. Their eyes follow, their hands reach. If one is chosen, one must remember or be claimed. Memory is their tether to the living, and the living must honor it. I put the journal down, my hands trembling. The historian had been a witness. The altar, the smoke, the woman and the child, they were all tethered to memory, to remembrance. My own fear now seemed secondary. I had a responsibility, though I was still only a stranger. The scholar watched me, eyes sharp. Remember, foreigner, history is not always written in ink. Some truths are carried in whispers, in smoke, in bones. If you leave this alley, do not forget what you saw, or you will be haunted, not by stories, but by history itself. I left the shop with the journal pressed to my chest, feeling its weight more than its size. That night I returned to the alley, the woman and child waiting as usual. I placed the journal at the altar, bowing low. The smoke swirled around the pages, lifting the ink as though inhaling it. I felt the woman's presence close, the child's small hand brushing mine. Their eyes were no longer accusing, no longer pleading. They lingered with quiet patience, as though acknowledging that their story would finally be carried forward. For the first time since the photographs, the footsteps at my bed were absent. Sleep came cautiously, with the faintest sense of relief. But the alley, the altar, and the unmarked graves still waited. I knew my journey had only begun. I had learned their names, their faces, their suffering, but now I had to carry it. Memory was a tether, yes, but it was also a burden and a duty. I had spent days with the historian's journal pressed against my chest, rereading the passages that spoke of the alley, the altar, and the unmarked graves. Each line carried the weight of sorrow, of lives snatched too soon, of grief buried beneath stone and time. But reading was not enough. Memory alone would not release them. I had to act. The old woman had instructed me in whispers, her voice grave. At midnight, when the city sleeps, you must speak for them. Light the altar, offer incense, and call their names. You cannot do it halfway. If you hesitate, they will know. I spent the day preparing. I collected rice, fruit, candles, and incense. The night air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of fried garlic and distant cooking fires. The alley was quiet, deceptively so, as though it too held its breath for what was about to unfold. As the hour approached, I approached the altar with trembling hands. Candles were lit, their flames flickering in the alley's darkness. Smoke curled and twisted upward, carrying with it the faint scent of charred wood, the echo of forgotten voices. I knelt before the altar, bowing low, and began to chant the names I had learned from the journal, the whispered syllables of those who had perished. The woman's face appeared from the shadows, pale and sorrowful, her eyes fixed on me. The child hovered nearby, silent, watching, waiting. The temperature dropped suddenly. The smoke thickened until it clung to my skin, burning slightly in my lungs. Shadows moved within the haze, forms indistinct but present. I could feel them, hundreds of them, surrounding me, pressing in. Their grief was heavy, tangible. I spoke louder, naming each soul I had learned of, invoking memory with every word. I could hear the whispers of the alley respond, a susurration that seemed to come from every wall, every stone beneath my feet. Then the air shifted. A cold wind swept through the alley, extinguishing some of the candles, making the flames dance wildly. The woman and child remained, their forms clearer than ever. But behind them I began to see others emerge from the smoke, shapes twisted with rage, the echoes of sudden, violent deaths. The ritual was no longer just a call for remembrance. It had become a confrontation. "Remember us!" a voice cried, not one but many, a chorus of anguish rising from the depths of the alley. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. The child reached out, and I realized his hand was warm, solid, unlike the others. He looked at me with eyes that were both pleading and guiding. "You must finish," he whispered. Summoning every ounce of courage, I knelt again, holding the remaining incense tightly. I spoke with deliberate clarity, calling out the names, recounting the stories, honoring each life, each tragic death. I described their laughter, their fear, their fleeting moments of joy. I acknowledged their suffering. I promised that they would not be forgotten. The wind subsided, the smoke thinned, and for a brief moment, silence enveloped the alley. I could feel a shift, a release. The heavy pressure of grief began to lift, though the memory of it remained etched in my chest. The woman stepped closer, her eyes softening. She extended her hand, and I felt a warmth unlike anything I had known since arriving in Hanoi. The child mirrored her movement. Their presence was no longer a weight, but a bridge, connecting the living and the dead. I stayed until the first signs of dawn brushed the rooftops with pale light. When I rose, the alley felt different, lighter, yet sacred, as though acknowledging that I had done what was necessary. The old woman appeared silently, her face unreadable. "You have done well," she said softly. "They will rest. But remember, memory is a living thing. Do not let it fade." I nodded, understanding that the ritual had not only honored the dead, but bound me to them in a covenant of remembrance. The woman and child faded into the morning mist, leaving the alley quiet once more, the altar intact, its offerings untouched but charged with meaning. As I walked away, the city awakening around me, I knew that the haunting had not truly ended. The spirits had departed, but their stories remained, threaded through the alley, through the journal, through the memories of all who dared to listen. And somewhere in the quiet moments, I would still hear the soft clatter of wooden clogs, the whispers of gratitude, the faint echo of a child's laughter carried by the smoke. The midnight ritual had not freed me entirely from the presence of the past. Instead, it had connected me to it, tied me to the alley, to its memories, and to the souls who would forever linger at the threshold between life and death. I realized then that some stories do not end. They continue in memory, in ritual, in the silence between heartbeats. And some guardians of the past will always choose those who listen to carry their truth forward. Days turned into weeks after the midnight ritual, yet the alley never felt the same to me. The air carried a faint scent of incense, even in sunlight, curling around corners and lingering on the stones. The woman and child had vanished from my dreams, but their presence remained, woven into my waking thoughts. I walked the alley often, not to provoke the spirits, but to remember. Every step reminded me that I was no longer merely a visitor. I was a custodian of memory, a keeper of the untold stories that had waited decades for someone to acknowledge them. At first, this responsibility felt like a privilege. I told myself it was an honor to carry their voices, to share them with those willing to listen. I recorded their tales, wrote their names in journals, and spoke aloud in the quiet evenings, hoping that acknowledging them would keep them at peace. But peace, I soon realized, was elusive. The first sign came subtly. At night I would smell smoke even when there was none. The faint creak of wooden clogs echoed through my apartment, soft enough to be ignored, yet persistent. Shadows moved in ways that defied the light. I told myself it was imagination, the residue of what I had witnessed. But deep down, I knew better. Then the dreams returned, not the terrifying visions of before, but fragments. The woman standing in the alley, the child by her side, always watching, always waiting. I could not touch them, could not speak to them, and yet their eyes followed me wherever I went. I began to notice changes in my daily life. Objects shifted when I wasn't looking. Small personal items would vanish and reappear in places I had never left them. A photograph on my desk, taken before I arrived in Hanoi, appeared once with faint smudges, almost like tiny handprints pressed into the surface. I started hearing whispers in crowded streets, soft murmurs that seemed to thread through the hum of life in the city. They were not threats, not curses, just reminders. Do not forget us. The old woman warned me of this, though her words came days later. I met her again at the edge of the alley near the altar, which now felt almost like sacred ground beneath my feet. You cannot carry memory without consequence, she said softly. They will follow you not to harm, but because you bear their story. You have accepted the tether, and it is permanent. I understood then that the midnight ritual had not released me from the past. It had bound me more tightly to it. By acknowledging the dead, by remembering them, I had opened myself to their world. Some nights the child appears at the foot of my bed, his small form solid yet ethereal. He does not speak, he only watches. Sometimes I feel his hand brush mine, just as it had during the ritual. And sometimes I wake to find faint impressions in the sheets, as if his presence had pressed upon reality itself. Friends and acquaintances began to notice the change in me. My eyes carried a weight, a depth that seemed older than my years. I spoke less, smiled less, and often stared into corners where shadows pooled. When I tried to explain, words faltered. How could I convey what it meant to carry the memory of hundreds of lives, to feel their grief as a living weight pressing into my chest? And yet in moments of quiet, I felt their gratitude. The alley, once a place of fear and unrest, had found a guardian. The altar, smoke rising, incense burning, stood as a bridge between the living and the dead. I was the living witness, and they were the past, no longer completely lost. But the tether had its price. I cannot sleep deeply without the brush of shadow, without the faint sound of clogs on stone. I sometimes awaken to find the smoke curling in my apartment, drifting around objects, forming shapes that vanish when I blink. Even in daylight, I sense eyes upon me, a constant reminder that the story is not mine alone. I have learned to accept it. The woman and the child are no longer threats, no longer phantoms of terror. They are memory made manifest, and I am the vessel. I write, I speak, I remember, not for glory, not for proof, but because forgetting would be worse. The alley, the altar, the unmarked graves, they all live within me now. And in the lingering smoke of every candle, in the twist of every incense curl, I hear them, their laughter, their sorrow, their whispered names. Some nights I swear I can see other shapes in the smoke, faint and fleeting, watching from the periphery. Perhaps these are other souls, drawn to the ritual of remembrance, seeking acknowledgement. Perhaps they are remnants of a past too heavy for silence. I do not fear them. I have learned that fear is not the point. To remember is to bear the weight, to live with the knowledge that life is fragile, And death, though often hidden, leaves its mark, and so I carry it. Even now, as I sit by the dim glow of a candle, watching smoke curl into the air, I feel their presence. The woman's eyes, the child's hand, the whispers of countless lives. They are threads weaving through my consciousness, binding past and present, living and dead. The alley is quiet tonight. The city hums beyond its borders, but the memory remains, a living thing that will not fade. I know deep down that it never will. The lingering smoke is not a threat, nor is it comfort. It is memory itself, persistent, demanding, alive, and I am its keeper. The alley, the altar, the unmarked graves, they live in me now, and I in turn will live with them always. Thanks for watching the whole video. Please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to watch more interesting stories.